All right, great. Thanks for coming out today. I'm sure you're all nursing a hangover, I hope. So I hope that's going well for you. So I'm going to present to you some research that I was doing as a postdoc at UC Berkeley, across the bay here, and that I've continued at GW University in Washington, D.C. So I think that first we should sort of take a look at some of the challenges. In California, for large wildfires, about 85% of these are caused by humans. We see massive damages throughout the state. Between 1999 and 2011, reported about $5.2 billion worth of fire suppression. There's also massive damages. Here they're reporting in that same time period $160 million in damage annually. So that works out to be about 13,000 structures. So I'm going to present sort of the first two components of a sort of three-part model. I have a few minutes to work with here. So I'm going to walk you through some of the basics and hopefully bring to light some of the primary findings and ignore a lot in the process, unfortunately. So the three parts here are a housing forecast model, a wildfire forecast model, and then the part that is missing here is then cost forecasts. So for the housing model, the idea here is essentially to predict housing density from 2000 to 2050. This is done using a spatial panel regression model. This is an autoregressive panel econometrics model. So we're essentially saying that the housing density of a particular location is determined by what it was in the previous period, which makes a lot of sense. But we're also saying that there's spatial spillovers and that adjacent tracts can actually influence the densities of any particular location in the next period. But we also look at the effects of climate norms, distance to population centers, and determining the location of human settlements. So if we look at essentially the forecast and the change of housing density for this period, right, 2000 to 2050, we see sort of continued housing densification within the areas that you might expect, as well as in the wildland urban interfaces that have seen so much change historically. And really the point here is that humans drive both costs and ignitions in the Californian landscape. And of course, it's important to understand the location of these settlements and how they influence the fire regime, how they influence costs going forward. We can kind of zoom in a little bit and take a look at some of the model outputs. And essentially what you see is sort of the buildup of density in some of the most fire-prone areas of the landscape, including sort of the Berkeley, Oakland Hills, around Los Angeles, San Diego County. These are all areas that potentially both drive ignitions and drive costs in the future. So maybe the piece that you guys will be more interested in is the fire modeling. So the idea is to predict the number of wildfires in any particular cell for the same period, 2000 to 2050. We take a sort of wildfire limiting constraints approach to this. This is something that's been discussed thoroughly by my previous boss, Max Moritz, as well as quite a few other people. But we're essentially looking at the interactions of conditions, right? So fire weather, resources, available fuels, plant productivity, et cetera, as well as patterns of ignition, right? So this is lightning, human activities, et cetera. For this, we're using a zero-inflated binomial regression. So this is actually predicting the count, right? The expected number of fires in any, essentially, it's roughly 1 kilometer pixels. And it's a function of, it's a function, in this case, we're monitoring, conditions and resources using AET and cumulative water deficit. Both of these are essentially water balance outputs. So AET is a pretty good proxy of plant productivity. Climatic water deficit is a good indication of drought length and severity. And also, nicely, I think, it to a certain degree, mimics, well, because these are variables that are relevant to plant growth and plant distribution modeling, there's been quite a few studies demonstrating that. Without sort of assuming that we're changing the plant distribution, we're sort of proxying some of those changes where we're expecting areas that get significantly drier, there should be less resources available to burn, et cetera. So if we look at estimates of the current fire regime on the far right, or sorry, your far left there, we have the mean fire return interval. So this is the number of years between a large fire as estimated by the model. Things to point out, we are sort of capturing the general spatial patterns found in California, maybe with the exception of sort of the northwest where the model does not perform as well. Another really interesting piece is that we actually can see the sort of net suppressive effects of urban development, as well as the net sort of incitement of fire around the sort of outer edges of high intensity development. If we look at the change from the sort of previous 25 years, so this is the back cast, we can see that we're identifying more fires sort of below, sort of in the lower parts of Los Angeles County, San Diego County, as well as clearly the deserts, right? So we've seen the movement of invasive species into these areas due to really anthropogenic processes as much as anything else, and I'm sure you guys know more about that than I do. We also see the increase in fires along the Sierra, and this is something that's been sort of identified by other modelers like Westerling that found that increased fire severity and number throughout the Sierra. So I think that this is a fairly realistic rendition of this. I'm going to skip that and come back to it in a second. So going forward, we ran it on, this is CMIP 5, or sorry, CMIP, the previous CMIP round. These are PCM Climate A2 and GFDL A2. And essentially these are acting as sort of boundaries. One is sort of a hot, dry south. The other is a wetter north. Then GFDL is a sort of hot, wet south and a drier north. And what you can see is that the response to vegetation, the response to rainfall and available water supply due to changes in precipitation, and the fire response that follows that. You can also see the influence of human settlements. That sort of big green circle has to do with the way that I modeled the effects of proximity to housing density. Basically, I modeled it as the maximum density within 50 kilometers of an area, so places like Los Angeles kind of pop out at you. But I don't think it's an unreasonable approach. If we break down these findings for the sort of future scenarios by natural and human contributions, we get something that looks like this. So this is essentially the expected fire count broken down by natural contributions and human contributions. And what we're seeing here is sort of a natural fire regime that mimics what you might expect, and then an anthropogenic fire regime that really demonstrates, brings to light the effects of the WUI and sort of intensifying the number of ignitions and fires on the outer edges of our settled landscapes. So we can break this down by that same sort of human influence, or sorry, the human contribution. We can break this down by distance to populated places. So here's a scatter plot for a few different ecoregions. We have the sort of central west, the Sierras, and the southwest. What you can see is that sort of routinely in areas that have really high density settlements like the central west and southwest, there's this sort of net suppressive force in the sort of downtown central area, of course, right? There's very few resources. But as you sort of move out of those populated areas, you have a net ignition effect. Right? So, and also interestingly, you can see how the ecosystems really affect the anthropogenic forcings if I can say that. So in the Southwest, right, where conditions are generally better, you're going to have, and really generally better just outside of the urban areas, you have a very strong net effect on the fire count, whereas in the Central West, you don't see as much of a response. And in the Sierras, interestingly enough, it's not really showing very much, or very many pixels where there's sort of this net suppressive effect, and instead the human contributions tend to be positive. And I think that these are all fairly reasonable findings. So the conclusions that I'd like to sort of bring to light is, first, anthropogenic influences cannot be ignored. I think to a certain degree they are. I think that many of us come from sort of earth sciences, and we sort of forget the fact that climate change is a big piece of it, but also land use change and the patterns of settlement are largely what determines where ignitions happen and when. From this model, in many locations, the human contributions accounted for about 50% of total fire counts. I also want to point out that these effects vary, of course, by ecosystems and by characteristics of the built environment. And I also think that by ignoring anthropogenic effects, we're likely exaggerating the climatic response of wildfire to changes in rainfall patterns and that sort of thing. So that's my findings. And do you guys have any questions?
Okay, so we have time for some questions. Sure.
In your housing model, do you take into account of the geographical constraint, such as the topography or actual there is already or do you just use a spatial expansion around the cell?
Yeah, there are constraints on slope. These are all estimated parameters. So there's a nonlinear function that looks at the effects of slope on housing development. And I think that, looking around, Californians are far less sensitive to a lot of the sort of general perceived risks. As you can see in San Francisco, people are built in areas that seem rather extreme to somebody from the East Coast. So we do control for that, but you don't see as big of an effect as you might expect. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
You can come up to the microphone.
So I'm wondering what's the size threshold for your lot wildfire events?
Oh, what's the size threshold? Yeah, these are the FRAP reported fires. So I think they have to be over 50 or 100 acres. I'm not quite remembering off the top of my head. So these are larger wildfires. Yeah, certainly there's a lot of small ignitions that actually don't get recorded, with the exception of through the Moritz product, which I haven't integrated yet. Okay.
Any more questions? Oh, sorry.
So maybe specifically for Southern California, did you account for differences between the fires happening in autumn driven by the Santa Anas or the summer fires in some way in your model?
Yeah, so at the moment we're not accounting for wind-driven fires, which is a big shortcoming for sure. A large problem with this is just the fact that we're doing a forecast model, so the availability of extreme wind events in forecasting is not quite there. There's a few people working on it, I'm sure, and if you know anybody that's working on that, I'd love to meet them. So let me know.